I'm David Uhlman. I'm the CEO of ClearHealth. ClearHealth is a company that does facilities management. We have a practice management and an EMR system as well that are under the GPL software license. In terms of facilities, dollars, people, I haven't seen anything else that says different. We're probably the largest company that's out there doing that. At least our commercial enterprise is certainly the largest. We work in a variety of systems, generally in the medium to larger scale. Our largest system is a 40-some-odd site network that does about 1.5 million encounters a year. So a pretty busy set, something a little bit different in scale and type than, say, an individual provider practice. I'm going to talk today about our experience with VistA. I think most of you in this room know what VistA is. We have a very different take on VistA. Our system is quite distinctly different from most of the other VistA-derived systems out there. It's not a rebranding. It's not sort of a reinterpretation. It's a radical departure from how VistA normally operates. I'm not going to talk too much about the technology, but if you're interested in this sort of thing, you can certainly look at our approach, and we'll talk today about some of the lessons we learned in taking VistA from the VA and turning it into something that we felt was appropriate, that was sustainable, that was horizontally scalable. And I'm not going to get too technical about what we did. I'm going to talk more about the broad lessons that I think VistA can offer us all, and some things that often get lost in thinking about VistA purely as a single piece of software, a magic DVD. You put it in, your practice is magically running that software, and all your problems are solved. I have a 20-minute presentation, so it was intended to be pretty quick here. We have a little bit more time. I'm going to slow it down a little bit. We're going to go through 15 slides, and we're going to start talking about my favorite car of all time, which is the 356 Porsche. And we're going to end talking about the iPhone 4. The 356 is a car from the 50s era. From my standpoint, I think it's a pinnacle of engineering and design. You have a company like Porsche, which was excellent in racing. They won a lot of races. They built very fast, powerful cars. They solved a lot of unique problems at that point in time. When they decided to transition from a pure racing company into more of a consumer car company, they took that racing experience and they built the 356. Has a lot of nuance and a lot of detail, certainly very aesthetically pleasing to many people. Even today, it's one of the most sought-after collector cars that are out there. I think to a large degree, the engineering that they did is still some of the finest engineering that's ever been done in cars. A lot of the lessons that they did in the 50s, in the 60s, are still found in a Porsche you would buy today. That, I think, is almost unheard of. If you go and you drive a Chevy, you drive something from that other era, you're driving a different car now than you are today. Porsche is not like that. You can really drive one of these that's 50, 60 years old, and they're still out there, they're still running. You can hop into a new 911, you're going to feel that similarity. They're very similar in design. And so, to me, that's proof of a design that works. And I think that's a corollary to VistA. VistA is the oldest, biggest, most comprehensive EMR that's ever been built. It's used in one of the largest systems, probably the largest system if you're talking about a long time scale. At its peak, a little bit before the dawn of VistA as the software, the Veterans Health Administration had 115,000 beds servicing veterans towards the end of World War II. That's one of, outside of China, and if you look at China today, its systems are still very fragmented. That is one of the largest, maybe the largest healthcare system that's ever been accomplished on a systematic scale. Jumping back to our car example here, we talk about the Porsche and we talk about racing. I think a correlate can be made about something that the Veterans Administration does, which is, to a large degree, a particular type of care. It's general health care. It's applicable to a lot of different people. But the VHA is not the same as every commercial practice and everything else that's out there. And so there's a transition that has to happen. When we're talking about this car, transition is from racing. You need to warm up the car before you get into it. These cars are often very cramped. And so Porsche designed a push-button start. They still have that today, so that you can reach in through the window, you can turn the key on, and you can push a button to start the car. You don't have to be sitting in the car to start it. That's carried through their consumer vehicles. For a lot of reasons, it's a pretty handy way to do things. In their gear shifter, they took a car that was designed to go fast, and they laid out the gearbox differently. For those of you, there's not many of us left that know how to drive stick. In a Porsche, the gearbox has the second and third gear in the middle, so that you can rapidly upshift and downshift from second to third gear. That's how you accelerate out of those corners. It's very different from an American car you're going to find. Those details are what make it such a fantastic car to drive. There's not much else that I really want to do from the 1950s. But driving these cars, you can hop in it, you feel it, you feel connected to the road and everything else in a way that you don't. For healthcare, VistA is a miracle to me, because you took a federal government, which when they design things, often comes up with something incredulous like this, where you have many different people, many different stakeholders contributing their ideas. You have a contractor who really doesn't care about the outcome because they get paid either way, and they lump them all together. The politics are involved, and you end up with the mobile TV, VCR, AM, FM radio combo. And VistA is really an affront to that. It's a system that was designed iteratively for, granted, a lot of money, but not a lot of money when it comes to the federal government. It solves real problems. It solved real problems for a very long time. It's really a breakthrough in design and government technology projects. I think it would be very difficult to find any other project from a software standpoint or workflow standpoint that was as complex, that's been undertaken by the government, has been successful. You've seen intelligence agencies, the FBI, the IRS, pretty much everybody else has tried to modernize and failed and failed and failed. FAA, man, that thing is just a black hole into which we are shoveling money, and it still probably is not going to be resolved in our lifetimes. We're using radars that are 50 years old, and they're not Porsche-style radars. So the amazing thing to me about this meaningful use guideline that has come out, and there's a lot of paperwork on that, but essentially it distills down to 20 some odd specific things that medical practices can do to receive this incentive money from the federal government. And when you look at those guidelines, pretty much all of them were in VistA starting from the very first day that it's been out there. So 30 years ago, the VHA was able to figure out, hey, here's a good way to run a medical practice, here's a good workflow, here are specific things we're going to do, from lab results to ordering to how you organize and display information. Here we're looking at pediatric growth charts that are electronic, probably the first system to have those. And they've known it for 30 years. It took 30 years for Congress to catch up. It took 30 years for the rest of healthcare to catch up about what was going on and why you might want to, what you might want to take into consideration in an EMR system and how you use that EMR. So to me, that's also a remarkable feat, a remarkable win for the VHA and the VistA system. It has great usability. This is a heat map of click activity in a standard day on our particular VistA system. And you can see that activity is primarily focused around the tabs. It's primarily focused around some of the toolbar. All of the usability research that we've done has really shown VistA as a very strong product in terms of usability. That was not at all what we suspected going into it. We really didn't think that was going to be the case, but the science is the science. When you look at eye activity, when you look at things like click heat maps, you really see that in terms of the distance traveled, which is how far I need to move the mouse to perform certain activities, how quick responsiveness is, overall layout, those types of things, you always come back. There's maybe a few areas that need some tweaking, but in terms of where I thought it was going into our research and where it came out, were two different worlds. So that, again, speaks very well to the iterative design that was done at the VA. That being said, certainly CPRS, the system that some people are familiar with, Delphi, that's not going to win a beauty contest. Our own system, a lot of the approaches that have been taken, they're not the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world. Apple did not design these UIs. But again, the usability backs that up. So it's a case where, to some extent, functionality has prevailed. And I think certainly in the medical setting, the data, the number of things that are being done, it's so complex. It's very hard to fit all that in a pretty way onto these little screens that we have. I think as we start expanding into the world of even much larger displays, real 3D types of displays, I think finally we'll be able to have some more visually pleasing displays. But for now, VistA is doing pretty well. So we're going to move on to lesson 2 here. We have 5 lessons. One of the underrated resources of VistA, maybe the underrated resource of VistA, is not the software itself. It is the collective effort of very smart physicians, technologists, so forth over the years to coalesce the single biggest resource about how to use EMR, how to operate EMR, how to implement EMR, how to install EMR, how to run protocols and methodologies and all that as a facility, I think that's ever been done, or certainly that's widely available. And not only that, because it's been done by the government, your tax dollars paid for, it's available to you at no cost. Almost all of that is online at that website I mentioned here. va.gov. Or if you Google search, you can say site va.gov, and you can put in some keywords, and you can find pretty much any keyword you could conceive of. The VA has at least recorded something about it. I view VistA as a lot more than just the software, and I think that's a valuable perspective that's taken me a pretty long time to sort of come around to. I think 5-6 years ago, when I first looked at the VistA software, I was really left scratching my head about why in God's name anybody would want to put themselves through this. But over time, again, for these reasons I've talked about, this design, this availability of documentation, when you have an oncologist and you're trying to understand how chemotherapy protocols work, where do you learn about that information? If you're on a software side, how do you understand that in a deep enough way that you can implement software that can achieve those goals, especially in something like that where people's lives are on the line? Well, the VA has a lot of documentation on that. It ties together the aspects of healthcare and the aspects of technology in a way that really nobody else has. And that is an extremely valuable resource. So we use that all the time. It has documentation about how to operate the system itself, sure, but even that several levels beyond that. I should make an honorable mention for the Indian Health Service as well, and their system, which is sort of VistA derived. They've done a good job focusing a lot more on the ambulatory side. We're going to talk about lesson number 3 here. Building on what we talked about in lesson number 2, VistA is the sum of healthcare information, at least in the United States. There are many associations, many organizations out there, the American Diabetes Association, American Medical Association, all those, where all of those things come together is in the Veterans Health Administration. They have staff pharmacologists, they have staff providers, they have all these people working all day long to solve these back-end issues that from the software side look like a tiny little tip of an iceberg, but when you start going back and you're saying, well, how are we actually going to handle drug interactions? How are we actually going to build formularies and manage formularies and pharmacy benefits and all that? How do you do that? It's a lot more than just the software. You're talking about how do you bring people together, bring facilities together, bring equipment together, and connect that using the software. The software is just this little glue that holds all together these complex pieces. Lesson number 4. This is something that really I fought tooth and nail against for a very long time. The idea that the EMR is the best place for doctor-to-doctor communication, for system-to-doctor communication, doctor-system, all these things like chats, alerts, reminders. From a technology standpoint, there are much better tools out there than what you can sort of bolt on to an EMR workflow. Especially now in this age where there's sort of the dawn of social networks and Twitter and all this, amazing ways to share information. The problem is that in a healthcare environment, time is really at a premium. You can't easily contain privacy and all these things, HIPAA compliance, using these varied tools. You have doctors that their primary responsibility is a physical person in front of them or right next to them. They can't be engaged in many different tasks on the computer. They really have to do things very, very quickly. When you see a successful EMR in operation, you see the physicians use it, they're using it at a lightning pace. Much different than a lot of other industries where sort of this point and click and more interactivity is acceptable. That's because the EMR is secondary to that doctor-patient interaction. VistA, obviously, they knew better. They've had for a very long time an excellent set of messaging tools built right into it. Not necessarily on the chat side, but just in terms of alerts and reminders and how all these things coalesce, business rules that drive intelligent alerts, automatically printing and notifying things in different places. A lot of lessons there that are crucially important to any implementation you're going to be doing today. I think for me, I resisted having a chat feature built into our system for a very long time, until I really saw firsthand by being at some VA facilities how some of this messaging was used, how it's tied to ordering. The firsthand experience of that was very valuable for me, and so now we've implemented that, and it's one of the most popular aspects of the workflows that we provide, because it's a very generic tool that lets individual doctors, individual departments solve their own problems very simply. And it also, because it's tied into the EMR, it's a familiar interface. It's set up so that all the audit and appropriate HIPAA compliance steps can be maintained, those sorts of things. Coming to lesson number 5, we have workflow and implementation. when you look at the difficulties of rolling out VistA, you say, okay, I have the software here. That's pretty easy. You download it, you have it. There's a few technical hurdles to achieve in actually getting it setting up and running, but it's not an Everest-sized mountain, it's a modest mountain. But when you look at actually implementing it at a practice, you're looking at sort of 1 to 6 to 12 months or longer for a larger facility, maybe even a small facility. What's that? Why is there that difference? That's the implementation. It's giving these doctors the software. At the time that you're doing that, you're radically changing the way that they provide healthcare. You're now bringing this new set of tools, this new tool bag, into the exam room, into the back office, into all of these things. They maybe have had some experience with computers overall, and you're using that now to record all this information that might be required for meaningful use, that might be required for improving patient outcomes, collecting all that data, displaying it in new ways. But at the end of the day, the doctor still has to talk to the patient. And so reconciling all of those different points is a very difficult process that often leads to unexpected effects. Here's a perfect example. It's a little bit of a bad image, I apologize. This is my dad's cell phone. So my dad comes in and he says, hey, what's the best way, do you think, to remove pen or marker from the outside of the cell phone? I thought, oh, I don't know, maybe my niece or a nephew or something had written all over it. So go and look at his cell phone. He can't figure out how to use the contacts list. So instead, what he was doing is writing the numbers on the back of the cell phone. Well, it works. I mean, it's not the ideal way to do it, but it's a classic example of a failed implementation. The tool's there. He's a smart guy. He knows how to use it. Couldn't quite connect the dots there, so he did what he had to do in order to use the tool. That's a lesson that the VA's learned very hard. There's a lot of anecdotes in the VA about the tale of two cities, where you might have two VA facilities in the same building sometimes, in the same city. One goes swimmingly smooth, updates, everybody's on there. Another one is a lot more of a difficult challenge. And the difference, again, comes down to implementation. You can't take a one-size-fits-all software solution and just throw that onto a DVD and plug it into a practice. You have to look at the unique needs of that practice. Healthcare is as varied as any industry I've ever seen. One of my favorite expressions, I use it a lot, is that once you've seen one medical practice, you've seen one medical practice. We operate more than 400 organizations in many sites, and I don't hesitate to say that they're all unique. Not a little bit, but very unique. We have two doctors in the same building or two practices in the same building doing the same line of care, and they might as well be in different universes. Just about everything is different. A lot of reasons for that, medical schools, so on and so forth. But when you're trying to install software and get people to use it in a correct or a positive way, you really have to think about the workflow and all that. So we have these 3 rules of implementation. Second rule is workflow. Here's another example. This is a training failure. So you have a modern copy machine. What is wrong with this picture? Somebody put the paper in it because it was out of paper. They didn't take the wrapping off the paper. Again, that's a tool, that's a person, probably a pretty smart person, not understanding all the implications about how to use that tool. And particularly in healthcare, there's a challenge, which is that 65% of providers rate themselves as a novice to intermediate when it comes to technology. We're now asking them to take their life's work, essentially, it's not very easy to become a doctor, and radically change it and put it all in the computer. For a 15-year-old in high school, that's not really a big deal. But if you spent 10 years in medical school, 10 years practicing, all of a sudden now you're being asked to rework this. That's a difficult set of steps. Not only that, but healthcare is a serious business sometimes. At the bottom line it is, because you're dealing with people's health. It's not as simple as a Facebook or a Twitter or a Google or anything like that. So again, on these workflow issues, you can have the best tool, and I think VistA has really shown itself now to be one of the best tools, maybe the best tool. You can have very smart doctors, but the way that you bring those two things together, as important as the VistA software is, it's just as important to look at the VA's experience in using VistA, to talk to those physicians, to read about how they've implemented things. Those lessons are absolutely crucial. There's some folks that may be in here today, like Matt King and some others that have done implementations, and they can tell you that it's a little bit harder even than they could have ever imagined. So rule number 3 is workflow. You can have the right tool. Vista has been well thought out, well conceived. It's a thoughtful design. But sometimes it's just not the right tool for that job. So you have to know when it is that Vista as it exists is not going to be a good fit for your type of facility. And there's no single answer to that question. But a lot of times when you start to get into the more esoteric types of specialties, and especially it's getting better, but on the mental health side, on some of these things that were not big priorities for the VA, you're going to hit some hard limits about how these technologies work. And when you're applying commercial practice methodology, what you do in your commercial practice where you do have a bottom line and you do have sort of marketing and all these other things that don't exist in the VA, you have to think about the implications of the original intent of VistA and how that's now applied to what you're doing with it. And that's a hard-learned lesson for us, definitely. There's a lot of lost in translation things that can happen there. And so finally, that's, in conclusion, our experience and kind of some critical lessons about VistA, more than just the software, but also about the practical reality of using it to power practices. I'm happy to take some questions here. I think we have some time. And you can contact us at our website down there or send us an email, and we'll be happy to answer it. We have some forums, and we also have a link on our website through the forum where you can download the source code as well. Thanks. Any questions? Well, hey, that's easy. Let's go. Let's eat. Oh, I'm sorry.
How does there have been several providers that have presented on VistA. How do you compare to some of the other providers who have been here, or other services that have been here that offer VistA? What makes you unique?
Well, definitely our approach to VistA itself, the specific way we implement the technology, we're a web-based system, so that on a technical level is, I think, different than anybody else, or mostly different. We tend to operate, as I said, on these medium and larger scales, whereas a lot of folks have been pushing VistA down into the very small single doc, 2-doc office. And we have some experience with that. We have a new product rolling out later this year that's more oriented towards that. But in terms of big systems, that's where our primary experience is. That's where most of our commercial business is. And just in terms of the scale of our own operations, we're a pretty big company. We're 100, give or take, people, and have a lot of background in doing beyond just the software, but actually managing facilities now and interacting with at all levels of a practice, from the medical direction down to the technical level, down to the backside on billing and so forth, so on.
Do you operate in MUPS then?
We don't operate in MUPS, no.
And how did you manage?
With a lot of money and a lot of man hours, pretty much. If we go back and we talk about reference data, one of the primary resources that we have as part of the open source download is that most of the data that's all tied up in the VistA software in MUMPS in terms of medications, interactions, clinical engine, clinical business rules, a lot of those things we've been able to distill out and codify into more accessible formats for most people, things like XML. A lot of what we do on the UI is PHP, those sorts of things. On some of the back-end functionality, it's just a lot of teeth pulling to get MUMPS to compile into various types of libraries that we use and things like that. Our front end is web-based, written mostly in PHP, as well as some C++, those sorts of things. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about your technology stack and also what your open source philosophy is?
Sure. So touching your first question first, the technology stack. One of our core requirements in implementing VistA for the size customers that we do was horizontal scalability, which on its face, VistA is more of a vertically scalable application. You start running it on more powerful single servers with more memory and things like that, whereas we're typically using clusters, a lot of more inexpensive, varied hardware that could be in different locations that has sort of high reliability, those types of things. We use primarily a LAMP stack, which would be the Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. Of course, on the desktop as a web-based system, you can use whatever it is that you want to connect to that. We use a variety of newer technologies to help assist what it is we do in terms of key stores like Memcache and a SQL database which allows persistence and more traditional style reporting, those sorts of things. A good technical thing to mention about VistA that we didn't talk about here is that if you're interested in implementing pretty much anything in healthcare, there's a technology called Entity Attribute View, EAV. In the VistA sense, that's often called FileMan. It's one of the core aspects of how MUMPs and VistA are implemented. And it's a technology worth learning about in general concept, because without that, you really can't do healthcare. To answer your second question, could you refresh my memory? I'm sorry, what was that?
What's your open source philosophy?
Oh, sure.
What's your license?
So our systems have always been under the GPL. A good portion of them are under the GPL2, and all the newer stuff is under the GPL3, and there's some cross-compatibility in that.
So have you set up, are you on SourceForge or Launchpad? Or
We're in GitHub, primarily is where our source is released, and then our own forums as well. I think we do have FreshMeat, SourceForge, those kinds of places. Yes?
I hate to interrupt but there is one more talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, they told me there wasn't. No problem. Anyway, thank you. I will be at the Birds of the Feather session later this afternoon or evening, so thanks again. Have a great day.